Voyage of the Frog by Gary Paulson. Chapter 1. David Alsbus stopped at the locked gate. He felt his hands on the weight of the small box which he could not stand to see yet, looked down on the small sailing boat, and tried not to cry. She was 22 feet long, with 2 wooden bowsprits sticking out of her nose, and a stainless steel pulpit above it. Her mast and boom were made of wood, kept in good shape and the varnish to a high sheen, and she had stainless steel lifelines all around the small cabin in the middle of 2 plastic portholes on each side. She was old, designed by a man named Schock in the mid-60s, so her old fiberglass hull had lost its shine and had a faintly sanded, opaque look onto it, although the original color, a robin egg's blue, still shone in its California sun. She had been made before they had fully understand fiberglass, and they learned that they could make it thin, so her hull was full half-inch thick. Somehow, it made her look stout, tough, and short, and low, and punchy, and stout. Across her stern was a wooden plaque on it that had hand-carved frog. David ran his hand over his face. The frog, he thought, and she's mine. I'm 14 years old, and I've got my own sailboat. My own complete sailboat, and I would get everything, all that I am, to not have it. He looked at it out across the small marina that was comprised at its Ventureluk harbor. There was a stiffening breeze kicking up the waves beyond the breakwaters, and he smiled, thinking of what his Uncle Owen called the waves. Lumps, he used to say, when they were getting ready to go out and the wind was blowing the sea around. The ocean is full of lumps. And there it was, used to say. His Uncle Owen didn't say anything now, not anymore. His Uncle Owen was dead. Oh God, he thought. This just stinks. It just stinks to have to be this way. He cradled the wooden box in one hand, and he pulled a plastic card out of his back pocket, and he looked at it. It was a Ventura Marina lock card, made out to Owen Alspeth. He put the card back in his slot next to the gate, heard the lock click, pulled the gate open. The tide was out, and the walkway sloped down at a steep angle, so that he had to hold on to the handrail to keep from trotting forward. At the bottom, the dock was flat, and he walked to the slip holding the frog. She wasn't locked. Owen didn't believe in locks, didn't believe in anything that held or confined things. If they're going to steal something, the lock won't stop them, he'd say. And nobody had ever stolen from him, though other boats in the marina had been hit several times. Didn't believe in locks or chains or tying things down. David thought, and he shook his head, and he tried to shake off his grief. The memory of the whole stinking mess pouring back into his thoughts. Owen had felt a backache and gone to the doctor on Monday morning, and by Tuesday he knew he was going to die. Knew that the cancer that he had would kill him, and that they could do nothing for him. And David controlled the tears. Down the dock a bit, an older man staring at him for a moment, then turned away. It had spread so fast, the cancer, so incredibly fast. A week after he'd gone to the hospital, they'd found more tumors in his brain, and Owen called David in to visit him. David wanted to go sooner, but while they were running tests, Owen had asked him to wait. David's parents, Owen was his father's brother. They were taking turns staying with him in the hospital. His mother had been there when David came the first time, and Owen asked her to leave. David hated hospitals. It was worse when saw Owen lying on the bed. He looked weak, caved in, dead already, dead and done. And when David saw him, he was overwhelmed with the change. His uncle's cheeks were sunken in, and his whole face cast in a gray that somehow looked even and flat. And the smell from him was a mixture of alcohol, urine, and feces. David had heard his mother trying to say that the tumor in his spine kept him from controlling himself from the waist down. Instantly, without a single thought that it was coming, David threw up. And of course, it made it all more horrible. Owen, his Owen, who was so close, his own Owen, who had taken him out sailing so many times, who always kept himself so neat that when the wind blew, his hair didn't move. His own sweet Uncle Owen. He couldn't see him without throwing up, making a mess all over the floor. To make it still worse, Owen laughed. A skull laugh. Some smell, isn't it? David thought, what can I say? That words that come out now to make it all right. And of course, nothing came, and he stood there in the mess, on his shirt, on the floor, looking and trying not to stare, hurting and trying not to breathe. He was taken by so much roar of hate that it made his vision blur, even more than the tears. There had been somebody to hit for this, he thought. There had to be some enemy to hit for this. This stinking death thing that was in the room. They think I might make it 2 more weeks, Owen said, struggling. His bony shoulders, or shrugging, sorry, his shoulders, like two bony hooks. Tubes seemed to be poking into him in many places, and they rattled when he moved. I doubt I'll make it a week, but who am I to know? David shook his head. Angry jerks. Don't talk like that. Things happen. People make it. There's things that can be done. There are always things they can do. But they both knew that the doctors could do nothing, could take nothing more from him nor add anything to help to save him. All they can do now is keep me drugged up and comfortable. Owen looked past David, out at the window and the hills back at the Ventra. The smog haze was thickening, and the rolling, brush-covered hills were bathed in a yellow muck. I want you to have the frog. Another violent shake. No, I can't take her. Not like this, not in this way. You love that boat. You live for it. David tailed off, paused, finished lamely. I just can't. It wouldn't be right. Owen turned the dial on a small box on the edge of the bed. A tube ran from the box into a needle that entered his arm. He had a pinched look at the corner of his eyes from the pain, but it lessened almost instantly. It's a drug computer, he said, sighing. It drips morphine into me, and I can turn it up when the pain waves up. That's all there is for me now. Little victories like that. I can turn a dial and soften the pain. My whole life has come down to that. Another silence. David was crying openly now, thinking of Owen. Once he had seen Owen dancing at the beach party with a heavy girl, and he picked her up and he held her up while he danced in the sand, holding her like a feather and laughing in his arms and legs strong, tight, and now he seemed to be about to break from the weight of the sheets. Owen reached slowly to the nightstand, next to the hospital bed, increasing the drug dosage, hitting him. And David saw now that there was a small envelope there. Owen scrabbled for it with his bony fingers, caught it, and handed it to David. Here's the title, signed over to you. You know how hard it is to find a notary in a public hospital? The Marina card is in there too. And the Marina card is in there. I think she still has some water in the tank. And there's some cans of food I left from my last trip to Caltina. I need a favor from you. Anything. And he meant it. I will die for you if it means I will save you. Anything. I'm going to be cremated, and I want you to take my ashes out alone on the Frog, out to sea alone, and leave me there. Take me to wherever you can't see land and scatter my ashes there on the water. David held the envelope and crushed it in his hand, and held it up while he cried, and the silence had become again. Come and stayed and groaned until David's mother came back into the room and it broke with a talk. He didn't make a week, just 6 days. On the 15th of May, while David was on his last day of school in 8th grade, his uncle Owen died in a drugged state resembling a coma. Even knowing it was coming, it hadn't helped. The grief tore at David and his parents. Owen had no other family, had never married, never stayed close to them, lived only 4 blocks away, ate with them, and was the first to take David sailing. Several times he had taken him 2 and then 3-day trips, out of Santa Cruz Island, once to Calatina, and now he was suddenly gone. Completely gone. David stepped onto the boat and felt her rock quickly to his weight, jerking lightly against the ropes that held her to the slip dock. Seagulls had been perched at the boom, and there was a mess on top of the cabin and the floor of the cockpit, and he stepped aside to miss it. He unhooked the hasp holding the sliding cabin top net hatch in place, slid it forward. His nose was immediately filled with a rank odor from inside the boat. The cabin hadn't been opened since the last time Owen had come to the marina over a month ago, and it smelled of mustiness and mildew and fungus and something else as well, something David could not pin down at first. When it came, finally, it stopped him cold. One hand on top of the hatch, it was the smell of Owen. No, more than that. It was Owen himself, the ghost of Owen. The smell was the boat and Owen, and David could not tell in his mind where the boat ended and Owen began. He sat then on the edge of the cockpit, holding the box, and cried, letting it roll out of him in uncontrollable heaves. His hands clasped between his knees, and the sound of the waves and the gulls and the sea around him. Chapter 2. He wasn't sure how long he sat, crying silently in the cockpit, but it was probably at least half an hour. It was late afternoon, and the commercial fishing boat came back into the harbor, which caused the gulls to flock back to the boat, looking for bait, and the crew would throw over the stern as they docked. The sound of the gulls wheeling and squawking wildly caught David's attention and snapped him out of it. He shook his head again and stood. He removed the 3 boards that dropped in the rear slot of the main cabin door, so it was not only open at the top, but in the rear as well, and swung down into the boat. The smell was still there, although now it was a bit more mold and musky. and he stopped and he looked at the cabin. She was, in reality, a small boat. 2 steps came down from the cockpit to the cabin floor. Directly in the middle, in front of him, was a table with 2 dropped leaves on each side. On each side of the boat, facing the table, was a bench with a cushion, which could also be used as a short bunk. Up front, peeked into the bow, was a double bunk filled with bags of sails, 6 of them. To his right and back under the cockpit was a single bed, what Owen called the captain's bunk, and to the left under the cockpit was a storage area. David wedged a small box that he held onto the shelf above it. Under all the bunks, except for the forward double one, were bins for more storage. No wasted space on the boat. Under the double was a water tank in which David thought was 20 gallons. He couldn't remember how much exactly Owen had told him. Somehow, it was very important to remember everything Owen had said. 20 gallons, maybe. They had been sitting in the Fry's Cove on an island in Santa Cruz, and Owen had said how important fresh water is to old sailing ships. Then they had put on masks and gone over to the side, and Owen had shown him 2 abalone stuck on a rock, and he popped them loose with a screwdriver, and he brought them up and cleaned them, and fried them in butter, real butter, and David had never tasted anything so wonderful. Memories. How the good ones cut the worst. The sweeter the memory, the more it hurt. Stupid how that worked. He shook his head again and looked to the boat. Down and to his right, there was a small sink and alcohol stove, and on the left was a stand with drawers, and on it, a tiny cutting board on top, and that, he thought, was that. 7 feet wide at the widest, and maybe 20 feet long inside if you counted the storage space under the cockpit. On the back of the cockpit, sealed off from the inside of the boat, only reachable from the outside, was a small hatch compartment called the lazaret, which housed the outboard motor and 5-gallon gas tank and a battery. Owen hated the motor, sneering and called it a cast iron mainsail, and David had never seen him use it, not once. Over the front bunk, there was a forward hatch, and he stepped past the table and propped it open up from the inside. Air immediately began moving through the cabin, and the muskiness seemed to disappear at once. He moved back to the rear and stood so that his head was out on the top of the door hatch. The cabin ceiling was only 4 feet 6 inches high, and looked around at the rest of the boat. Something in him made David want to know all about the frog, some drive that he did not understand, and he suddenly realized that it was the memory of Owen causing it. Owen had been so close to that boat that knowing the frog, knowing all that there was of her, was like seeing Owen again somehow. Owen had cared about how the boat sailed more than about how she looked. That's why the frog had 6 sails, even a spinnaker, and a tough one, a little storm tie sail. And now there was a cute little decal with one of those quippy little sayings. The captain's word is law, or marriages performed on this boat, good for duration of 1 voyage only. The top of the boat, the outside, looked like Owen as well. She was all business, stretching from the front pulpit to the back stationeer. All around the frog was stainless steel lifelines rigged in a stout stainless steel post. The mast was laminated spruce, a rectangle, and the boom was also spruce, but it attached to the right angle to the mast. with a worm gear and a crank arrangement so that the boom could be rotated to roll down a part of the mainsail in a strong wind. Action called reefing, a way to reduce the area of the sail. He knew that the crank in the hardwire drawer under the sink. In the same drawer, there was a sewing kit to repair the sails, another crank handle for the winches in the cockpit that tightened the jib, and some hand tools, and a couple of wrenches, a pair of pliers, and a set of screwdrivers and a plastic package. Everything, Owen once said, needed to sustain life. David thought of a small box on the shelf now. Life. All that Owen had been reduced to in a small container of ashes. Life. He moved forward in the cabin again and took the sailbag labeled Maine and carried it on top. The deck opened and a bag pulled the stiff darken cloth until it billowed out. It also smelled musty. And he started the fasteners up on the track of the mast, heaving down to the halyard. The rope hoisted the mainsail. As he added up, each fastened to the track. As he pulled them up, he also pulled the bottom of the edge of the fasteners out along the boom and put the stiffening boards and the batterns into the little pockets along the tailing edge of the sail, so that when it was all the way up to the top of the mast, it was also out on the boom. The evening breeze kicked against the sail, making it slap back and forth, and he smiled, thinking of Owen again. The slapping of the sails was called luffing, and Owen said it was the one of the few words that sounded just the way it meant. They had been sitting at the edge of the dock, joking and drinking cokes, and the comment triggered a whole string of words that sounded like what they meant. And finally, David looked up just as a pelican let go down the side of the mast and said, "Poop," which led to Owen mentioning that the back of the boat was sometimes called the poop deck. He wasn't sure, but it was probably because they used to go to the bathroom over the stern. And then the thought set the two of them off into making conversation, actually using those words they could say sounded the way that they meant. Ashes. Not life now, but ashes. David let loose the ropes, sheets, and held the boom so the mainsail could luff easily, and went below for the jib. He clambered up onto the bow and clipped the snaps of the jib sail into the foresail. The cable that ran from the tip of the bow up to the top of the mast and hooked to the top or the head of the sail to the jib, and the hay rail pulled up. The jib was loose, without the benefit of the boom to hold the bottom of the edge stiff. It slapped mightily in the wind, like a wild white rag. Now the boat was all noise, with wind luffing the sails and the boom slamming, making it back and forth, and the sails popping, and ropes whipping and claking, and the halyards slapping against the mast, whap and whap. The sound somehow made the boat feel urgent, as if she was impatient to go, and David knew then that he was going to take her out. He took a moment to put a life jacket on, buckling it tightly, and he had told his parents that he'd be spending the day and night on the boat in the marina, then sailing out the next day to leave Owen's ashes in the sea. But when he put the sails up, he simply had in mind that he'd air them, and then drop them and tie them off for the morning. But all that was different now. There was a fair breeze and no clouds in sight, and it seemed to be a perfect night for sailing. He had only a few times sailed out at night with his uncle, but he knew that it was Owen's favorite time to sail, and this was Owen's trip. His last trip. Chapter 3. When the sails were up and the halyards cleared off the base of the mast, He closed the front hatch, secured it from the inside, and unsnapped the line that held the tiller, or the helm, over on the side. Jumped off onto the dock. It took him a minute to uncleek the 4 lines that held the Frog to her slip, thrown them down on each side of the cabin. Then he pushed her gently backwards until she was sliding well away from the dock, jumped aboard, and pushed the tiller sideways. She was moving very slowly. The wind pushed her a bit, adding to the movement. David had started by giving her a nudge. And when he held the tiller over, it swung her stern around, so she laid aside to the wind in a large open area rear of the slip. The mainsail and jib were both luffing, and he grabbed the main sheet and pulled the sail until it filled. The Frog responded almost instantly by nosing forward. He cleated the sheet off, grabbing the gib sheet, and pulled the jib until it filled too. The Frog jumped up to the speed of 4.5 knots. It was a graceful, clean, neat, silent maneuver. Owen had taught him to sail from the dock before, and he let him sail to the open. Most people use their motors to get out of the marina, firing them up and giving the slip backwards, and backing out with great noise and smell. And that's how Owen put it. A great noise and smell. But he made David learn to feel the boat, learn to ease her backward out of the slip gently, silently, and then let the sails fill, move forward effortlessly. She made to move with the wind, Owen would say, made to feel the wind and move with it. The motor is an insult. The wind was perhaps 20 knots now, perfect for driving the Frog at maximum speed and comfort. And as he turned towards the harbor breakwater and mouth, moved her nose into the direction of the wind for a bit, he noticed that the wind came directly across the beam, straightening from the north as he headed west out towards the harbor. It was a beam reach, the fastest way to sail, across the face of the wind, and he turned the mainsail jib into the curved bellies of the power, which meant that they were using as much of the wind as possible. The Frog responded like a thing alive. She fairly jumped forward into the smooth water of the marina. David brought her up a bit more into the wind as she sailed between the 2 breakwaters, made of huge stones, 2 retaining walls that stuck out into the ocean, across the front of the 2 sails to block the sea from entering the harbor, was another retaining wall of boulders. He brought the Frog out to sea, holding her to the high side of the harbor mouth, the upwind northward side, to give himself as much room as possible to clear the wall. As it came open, he brought her down, wind a bit, let the sails out a hair, and the Frog slipped cleanly beyond the harbor and into the open sea. Immediately, the swells took her. In the marina, the water was like a lake, sheltered and placid, but as soon as the Frog cleared the retaining walls, she took the full Pacific Ocean head on. David could never get over the size of it. The feel of the swells, all the land masses of all the earth could easily fit into the Pacific, and there would still be plenty of water left. It was staggering. Storms from China mixed with storms from Alaska, and the power of those storms mixed and turned with storms from Australia. And the swells, the movement of the water from all those places, came to the coast of California. Thousands and thousands of miles, swells from other continents, from other worlds, came under the Frog now as she cleared the breakwater. And David thought again, still, of Owen. Every time they cleared the harbor, or every time David was with him, Owen became silent, looking out at sea. It was a silence of thought, almost reverence, a kind of worship. And David now did the same, felt the same. The sea coming under the frog in huge swells, sometimes towering 20 feet above the cockpit, and slid like oil under the boat and brought her sliding up, over, and down to the next swell, were like friendly mountains of water. They were not storm driven waves. David had never seen those, because Owen always carefully checked the weather before taking him out on trips. But he had heard of them, storm waves that tipped whole ships over and drove them underwater. These swells were more like rising waters, a lifting that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if hands were cradling or holding the frog. And the smell was different as well. In the harbor, there was a stink of living, the smell of other boats and the smell of cars driving by. As soon as the frog cleared the harbor, the wind brought the smell of the sea, rich and full smell of the Pacific across the boat was like a bath in a new wind. It was close to dusk now. The sun was just above the horizon, out ahead of the frog, and David eased her off the wind a bit more, letting the sails out enough to keep them bellied well, and pointed the bowspring straight at the sun. He checked the compass and saw that he was sailing south of west, close to 250 degrees. He mentally noted the direction. Slightly to his right and out ahead was 15 miles, was the Anpaca Rocks of Santa Cruz Island. He wanted to miss them with room to spare. If he ran a line just south of the channel of the islands and rocks, there was nothing until the Philippines, nothing until Japan, but ocean. And that's where Owen wanted to be. Take me out alone, Owen had said, until you can't see land, and just leave me there. And he would do it. The night sail for Owen would be perfect. By dawn, the frog would be well out of sight of land, well out at sea. David did some further mental calculations. He was making 7 knots, about 9 miles an hour. If he held this for 10 hours, he'd be 90 miles out at dawn. He hadn't checked the weather and felt vaguely unsettled about that because the frog didn't have a radio, except for a cheap little translator, a battery-powered receiver that hardly ever worked right. So he couldn't listen for weather reports. But it was a good boat, and there didn't seem to be any bad weather coming. The evening sky was clear and the wind steady. He would sail the line at 250 degrees west into the Pacific, a line west for Owen, into the night. He would sail till morning, and while he was sailing, holding a true line for Owen, he would think of his uncle. Think of all that Owen had been to him. A chill took him, as he lashed the tiller over with the tail of the main sheet, and he went below for a moment to grab his windbreaker. When he came up, the sun was setting. Just that fast. Directly in front of the frog, the sun seemed to boil down into the sea, almost as fast as it took him to think of. And as it sank, it cut a reddish golden beam across the sea, a golden path that came from the sun across the sea to splash light up against the frog, against David's face as he slid the cabin hatch closed and settled at the helm again. It was so beautiful that it took his breath away, and he thought that it was like a path for the boat. No, not the boat. It was a path for Owen, and a golden path for Owen. David smiled. Owen would think it was so hokey, so stupid to think that. He hated the Shalmass stuff like that. Hated omens. But there it was. The gold was there ahead, calling. David hunkered next to the tiller and held the frog on course, and thought, hokey or not, he would follow it into the night. Chapter 4. It was about 2 in the morning when the light appeared from the sea. He had heard of it, but he'd never seen it, and if he had not seen it now, he would not have believed it. David had sat awake throughout the long hours of the night, past midnight, sailing steadily, and the wind had not changed either in force or direction. And he held the tiller over, held her overboard, and reached through the night, and thought of Owen, thought of all the things that his uncle had been. Somehow it had made a large part of the grief lift to think that way, as the frog cut this calm sea, moved up to 8 knots, and he held speed, hour after hour, careening west to the ocean. He did not think of distance, did not think of anything but Owen. Owen sitting at the helm in the same place that David sat now, telling him what he really wanted to be, wanted to do. Nobody else knew, not even David's parents. He had spent his whole life working, one job to the next, working construction, clerking, getting by. But what he really wanted to do was study. Just that, study. I wanted to know all the things I don't know, he'd say. Sailing in the bright sunshine on a summer afternoon. You mean about the sea? David had said. Owen had nodded. But not just the sea, all of it. I wanted to know all of everything there is to know that I don't know. I want to know about other planets. I want to know about molecules. I want to know about art and science and music and love and hate and dreams and trees. I want to know everything. But that's impossible. And David had thought then how much he hated to study, hated the whole process of school. It was a drudge to him, something just to get through. Owen had held his hand up and told him a joke about an engineer and a pure mathematician. On one side of the room was a beautiful woman. On the other side was an engineer and the mathematician. Each man would be allowed to advance half the distance to the woman each time he moved. The mathematician said that it was senseless to try because the theory you would never reach her. But the engineer smiled and said, "You can get close enough." Owen had laughed. It's the same thing with studying, with knowing things. Maybe I can't learn it all, but maybe I can get close enough. I knew a guy named Elwood back before you were born. He lived here and spent his time learning at the beach at the Vetra. Just here. A short stretch of public beach. The most explored beach probably in the world. But he studied, and he worked at it, and he found 4 new kinds of oysters, named eelwood oysters 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And he discovered a kind of octopus right here on the beach, where there wasn't supposed to be anything more to know. Owen. Sailing through the night, David thought of Owen, wanting to know things, all the things. And a part of his brain kept pushing tiny warnings at him, but he didn't heed them. Quickly, he thought about that distance he had come, or was going to go. Short thoughts about mistakes that he had made or was making. Again, he thought of the weather, but only briefly, casually. He thought that he hadn't checked the provision of water, and he dismissed the notions because he wouldn't be out for long. Just out and back. He should be back by the marina by evening, if the wind held. Tiny thoughts. If the wind held. And at 2 in the morning, he saw the light of the water. He saw the first to the stern. In his wake, in silent bubbles to his left by the frog moving through the water, there was a ripple and a dotted line of eerie light glowing up from the water, a blue-green. It seemed to come from down in the water, and at first it startled and frightened him. But then he remembered hearing about it. Small animals in the water, microscopic organisms, sometimes phosphorized, gave off light almost like lightning bugs when disturbed. He must be going through a mass of them. In the back of the frog was a long line of blue light fading as the water settled down again. He tied the tiller off, leaning over the side, and looked over the front where the boat cut the wave and curled over. Oh! It slipped out of his mouth, unbitten, almost a sign of amazement. The boat was moving through blue fire in the night, and the bow wave with a rolling curve of blue light. It sparkled with bits of green, and it seemed to want to crawl up the side of the boat and then folded back over, splashing out into ripples and droplets of light. It could not be as beautiful as it was, not be that beautiful and real. It was so bright and shining, and a thing that the frog seemed to be moving through, a lake of cold fire. As he watched this, he saw the form move beneath the boat, caught the blue glow of the bow wave, torpedo form, shot forward, in an incredible burst of speed. And he saw first the glowing curve of the line around the head of the creature, and the line showed him that it was the front of a dolphin. All in seconds, in short parts of a second, he saw the head and the body moving forward beneath the boat. Then it exploded. The dolphin blew out of the water in front of the boat. It rose in a clean curve just in front of the bowsprit, 5, 6 feet out of the water, leaping a joy only dolphins can make, carrying with it a shorn of splashing blue-green fire that whirled and spiraled through the darkness to follow the dolphin up, over, and down, and back into the water, plunging in green light back into the depths beneath the frog. David was frozen in it, did not know how long he stayed, with one hand reaching up, as though it was to touch where the dolphin had been, touch the curve of blue fire. It was all there and gone, and suddenly gone as if it never had been. And his breath suddenly burst out into the sight of night. He looked back, expecting to see a dolphin as the boat went over, but there was nothing. Not a trace. Only the flickering blue lights of the frog's wake. And it came to him then, came into his mind like leaping dolphins, came into his light. Why, Owen, who found such beauty in life, wished to end his days amidst the leaping dolphins and blue fire and the lines of the sun gold across the water, the mother sea, beginning and end. David looked at the sails. There was a silver moon above the horizon, enough to make the pale light. A white of the sails caught it, gathered it, and shorn it down on him. He was bathed in the cold white light of the moon, washed and bathed in it. The tailing edge of the mainsail was luffing a bit, and he sheeted it into to clean it, the line up. The loosening had opened between the mainsail and the jib sail, so he pulled the jib in a bit to clean that, and the boat picked up speed. They were several hours into the daylight, 2 at least, maybe a bit more before the sky started to grow light. He wasn't sure how far he had come, but when he looked back towards the land, he could see it flickering lights above the horizon, probably lights in the mountains, so he wasn't far enough out yet. He looked at the compass again. The numbers glowed faintly in the darkness, but he could see them. In and he was still holding at the 250 degrees. Hours before, he had moved past the island, felt more than what he saw in the darkness, and headed to the open sea. It was, really, the first time he had ever moved out into the wide ocean. With Owen, he'd sailed to Cartagena and anchored, and they covered a fair distance, perhaps 50 miles of sailing to get there. But it wasn't the same. Still wasn't after the same as heading into the open sea, where there was not a tourist island waiting. They'd always been within sight of land, and Cartagena itself was only 26 miles from the city of Los Angeles. It was true, David knew. They had talked of it many times while sailing, that only the water around your boat counted, and you can get in as much trouble 1 mile from shore as thousands miles out. A quick wind squall could dump you in the sight of the harbor, and the waves could hold your head down, and that would be it, all in sight of the yacht club restaurant. And that was all true. But to head into the open sea, into a wide reaches of the Pacific, away and out of sight of land, was completely different, and it sobered him. Now he settled back into the business of sailing the Frog. There was still a long way to go.